Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad to be here with you all today. My name is Falon, and I'm the campus minister for the University Church here at Pepperdine. If you are visiting here or not a regular attender, I am not our usual preacher. Eric is out of state today for a funeral for one of Sharita's relatives, so our prayers are with Eric and Sharita as they travel and as they grieve and care for their loved ones. I am immensely grateful to have the opportunity to share a message with you today. I don't take it lightly that preaching is a sacred and powerful act. To preach is to start a conversation about who God is and what God is doing in the world, and about who we are and what God is calling us to do in the world. What a privilege to participate in that kind of work. And how fitting that we are in a series where we are looking at what the story found in 1st and 2nd Samuel reveals to us about God and about ourselves. Today, we are starting the second half of the story with 2 Samuel chapter 1. Since we're at the halfway mark, I think it's a good time for a recap of what has happened in the story so far. Way back before the book of Samuel, the people of Israel made a covenant with God to obey all God's commandments and be God's special people in order to become a blessing and an example of goodness to the other nations. But despite the covenant they've made, God's people take one wrong turn after another. The book of Judges reveals just how terrible God's people had become. Instead of following God's commandments, they trampled on each other. They chose violence against their neighbor. They followed other gods instead of the one true God. Instead of being a special people, set apart as an example of the good and life-giving ways of the Lord, the tribes are in absolute, utter chaos. That's the backdrop as we open the pages of 1st and 2nd Samuel. This is a screenshot of the timeline from the Bible Project's video about what happens in 1st and 2nd Samuel. By the way, I highly recommend the Bible Project as a Bible study tool. Their overviews of the books of the Bible are absolutely phenomenal, and they always help me better understand what I'm reading. So together, the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel tell the story of how God's chosen people transition from a hodgepodge group of tribes that won't stop fighting with each other into a powerful nation united under one king who is called to lead God's people in the ways of the Lord. The first king that is chosen is a man named Saul. At first, it seems like Saul will be a great king. He looks the part for sure. He's strong, he's big, he's powerful. But very quickly, it becomes apparent that Saul is prideful and selfish, and he's not connected to God at all. So God wants another king to replace Saul. Enter David. He comes onto the scene at the precise moment that Saul begins his descent from greatness to destruction. Unlike Saul, David is a humble teenager, a shepherd who spends his days tending to a flock of sheep. It is a surprise to everyone when God makes it clear that the shepherd, David, will be Saul's replacement as king. But as we read the next few chapters into 2 Samuel, we begin to see why David is God's choice. Last week, Eric preached on David and Goliath in 1 Samuel 17, which is David's big debut moment as a warrior and leader, and as a person with faith. In this series, Eric has been following the assigned readings from the liturgical calendar, and the next story has us jumping all the way from David and Goliath to 2 Samuel 1, when David finds out that Saul has died, and that's what Jen read for us today. But we cannot understand our story today without considering the very eventful chapters in 1 Samuel that come in between. Those stories directly inform David's song of lament when Saul dies. So here's what we missed in the story since last week's sermon. After David kills Goliath, Saul celebrates David and appoints him as a general of the army. As David climbs the ranks as a mighty warrior, he also quickly rises in popularity among the people. They love David. They literally sing David's praises. Pretty soon, the lives of King Saul and the shepherd boy turned military leader, David, are inextricably interwoven. David marries one of Saul's daughters and becomes Saul's son-in-law. David's best friend in the whole world is one of Saul's sons, Jonathan. David works in Saul's court, and at one point, David's music actually nurses Saul back to health when he is in danger of dying. David fights with Saul in battle as his most well-respected and dependable soldier, and most importantly, Saul is David's king, and David respects that Saul is the one on the throne. But as David rises in fame and popularity, Saul becomes increasingly paranoid. When Saul looks at David, he doesn't see his daughter's spouse or his son's best friend or his mightiest warrior or his loyal servant. Saul sees a threat. As Saul's insecurity and jealousy overwhelm him, he hunts David down to murder him. David runs away, hiding in the wilderness to avoid being killed by his king. We know from the book of Psalms in the Bible that this was a horrible time in David's life. He felt abandoned. He felt alone. He felt extremely anxious for his life, for his future, and for his people. David's only crime at this point is serving the people of Israel exceptionally well. That is why Saul wants him dead. And yet, David does not retaliate against Saul's cruelty. In fact, while he's on the run, David has at least 2 opportunities to kill Saul and put an end to it all, but he doesn't. Why? In the Psalms he wrote from this time of his life, David says that he trusts God to make all things right. David didn't have to meet violence with violence. David didn't have to kill Saul and cause civil war among God's people. David believed that all he had to do was trust that God would fulfill God's promises and make all things right. Ultimately, in a vicious battle against the Amalekites, Saul is killed with all 3 of his sons, including David's best friend, Jonathan. With the death of Saul's entire lineage, David's path to the crown is cleared, and he no longer has to live his life on the run. Seems like good news, right? But David's response to the news of Saul's death is surprising. Instead of gloating that Saul got what was coming to him, David laments the death of his king. Instead of thanking God for defeating his enemy, David praises Saul as a warrior. Instead of collapsing in relief, David collapses in tears. Let's reread 2 Samuel 1, verses 19 to 27. This is a translation I really like for poetry in the Bible because it really highlights the beauty of songs and poems. And this song is exceptionally beautiful. The beauty of Israel lies dead upon your high places. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Don't speak of this in the city of Gath. Don't proclaim it in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice. The daughters of the foreigners will sing for joy. Mountains of Gilboa, let no rain or dew water you. May your mountain fields offer only dust. The shield of the mighty was defiled with your enemy's blood. Even the shield of Saul is no longer anointed with oil. With the blood of the slain and with the fat of the strong, Jonathan's bow never lost aim. Saul's sword never came back empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and delightful, always together in life and now in death. They were faster than eagles. They were mightier than lions. O daughters of Israel, cry out for Saul, who clothed you in luxurious crimson, who adorned your garments with ornaments of gold. Oh, how the mighty have fallen in the height of the battle. Jonathan lies dead upon your high places. I agonize over you, my brother Jonathan. I have delighted in you, and your love for me was wonderful beyond even the love of women. Oh, how the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war lie broken. David's profound grief for Jonathan at the end of the song isn't surprising. Jonathan was David's best friend, his brother-in-law, and his fellow warrior. And Jonathan tried to protect David from Saul over and over again while David was in the wilderness. Of course, David is devastated by Jonathan's death. But Saul spent years hunting David down like an animal with the explicit intent of killing him. Saul robbed years of love and peace from David's life, and David is grieving him? Actually, not just grieving him, but painting him in an exceptionally good light, celebrating Saul as a mighty hero, a strong warrior, a good leader. How can we understand David's generous response to Saul's death, given all the suffering Saul caused for David and for God's beloved people? One theory is that the song is purely political. By grieving publicly, David is making it clear that he had no role in Saul's death, which means David would have a smoother path to the throne now that Saul is dead. Now, that's not necessarily completely selfish. David is a shepherd, and he has proven himself already to be a good leader who loves God's people. And we all know that smooth transitions of power are absolutely vital to the health and peace of a nation. So I don't fault David for taking public perception into consideration when he responds to Saul's death. And there is an interesting omission in this song that seems to suggest another layer too. As we saw during David's time in the wilderness, all of David's psalms always come back to his trust in God. But in this lament song, I can't help but notice that David doesn't mention God at all. That's uncharacteristic of him. If his mourning was politically motivated and exclusively performative, then it would have been really smart of David to leverage God in this moment. But he doesn't. I think what's happening here in this lament song of David is real grief. But this kind of grief is not straightforward. This is complicated grief. Maybe You can think of a time when your grief wasn't straightforward either. Maybe a relative you didn't have the best relationship with dies, and even though your heart aches for what your relationship with them should have been, you're also not as sad as you feel like you should be. Regret and apathy and guilt, that's complicated grief. Or your kids move out and you long for the days of a bustling household, but even as you wonder whether you did enough to prepare them for adulthood, you are also grateful for who they have become. Emptiness and pride and awe, that's complicated grief. Or you part ways with your significant other after a long time together. And even with a firm conviction that this was the best decision for both of you, you still remember the good times and wonder if you'll ever find another love. Anxiety and nostalgia and confidence, that's complicated grief. I remember when my uncle died after a long battle with MS. We grieved his death, of course, but we also felt relieved that he was no longer in physical and emotional pain, dismay, and comfort. That's complicated grief. When Nate and I moved back to Pepperdine from Lipscomb 3 years ago, we deeply mourned the loss of our Nashville communities. But we were also so excited for our life back here in our home, near our families, at the church and the university that nurtured us into who we are. It was bittersweet in the fullest sense of the word. Sorrow and delight. That's complicated grief. Those examples are not exactly like David's grief, but I think we can all admit that grief is complicated. And in David's situation, it is very complicated. Saul is David's enemy by every definition. But at this point in David's life, David is humble and compassionate enough to see Saul as more than his enemy. David remembers that Saul is also his father-in-law, also his best friend's dad, also the very first chosen king of God's people. I can't even begin to imagine all of the conflicted things David is feeling when he hears that Saul has died in battle. We see some of these emotions begin to come through as David sings for Saul. In this song, if we listen carefully, we can hear between the lines all of David's complicated grief, agony and nostalgia and respect and relief and fear and wonder and gratitude and trepidation and regret and love. David's grief contains multitudes, and as complicated as it is, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's actually quite beautiful, encouraging even. This song helps me see why David, for all his flaws and failures, is the one God chose as king. It helps me see David as a person after God's own heart. This song helps me understand why David loomed so large in the history of Israel that by the time Jesus comes on the scene, hundreds of years later, it was still the descendant of David that God's people longed for. This song is one of David's best moments as a human and as a leader. As complicated as his grief was, David grieved for his enemy. That's what it takes to be a faithful leader. That's what it takes to strive after the heart of God. As I dwelled with this song over the last few weeks, I kept thinking of some words of Jesus right at the end of his life. Throughout Jesus' ministry, people called him the Son of David, which means they understood him to be the fulfillment of God's promise to provide a king, a Messiah, a Savior, a deliverer. And Jesus did that. He came in the way of David, and he perfected what it meant to be king every step of the way. And Jesus even perfected what it means to grieve our enemies. As Roman soldiers placed him on the cross, and Jesus, in excruciating pain, prepared to die, he cried out to God these profound words: "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." In these words, I hear no conflict, no subtext, no confusion, no politics. I hear a straightforward grief that is perfectly united with love. I wish I could grieve my enemy like Jesus does, but the reality is, my humanity looks a lot more like David than like Jesus. David was only human, and like each of us in this room, he did nothing perfectly, including grieve, and yet God recognized David for striving after God's own heart. I would guess that in a room of people like this, we all experience and go through grief differently. I know that there are quite a few people in the middle of grief right now. And all of us have journeyed through grief at some point in our lives. It's just a part of what it means to be human. So I hear this song David sings as an encouragement to all of us. When we experience complicated grief for complicated situations and complicated people, we can take comfort that we are in good company with David. God sat with David in his grief. God sits with us in our grief too. God honored David in his grief. God honors us in our grief too, no matter how fraught our grief may be. David's complicated grief helps us trust that God is holding us close too, even as we sort through all the messy emotions that come with our grief. And thankfully, because of Jesus, the Son of David, who came to fulfill the promises of God, we too, like King David, can grieve with hope that God is making all things right.